Let's delve a little deeper into the frightening world of electric guitars. On the bench here we've got a 1970-something Gibson SG. Much seems to have changed since it was lovingly polished and laid gently into its form-fitting case at the factory. Well, the color has shifted somewhat. The headstock was broken, and a few slight modifications may have taken place. It's difficult to say. This is much loved. It's an ongoing project too. At a certain point some fun stuff happened with the head end. Decisions were made. But now the owner has come across. This appears to be an official Gibson headstock overlay. It looks like ebony, but it's actually a fiber material. Every once in a while something emerges with the description suggesting that there was some kind of halcyon age where repair people could get their hands on stuff direct from Gibson to make repair fun and easy. You know, I've seen rolls of ancient Gibson headstock logo decals, for instance. It would be nice to imagine that Gibson understood the nature of their headstock angle and were prepared to outfit the repair trade as a kindness, along with sort of a wink and a nod. I'm not so sure if that's wood grain or something from a thickness sander. Hard to say. As this is going to get painted black anyway, it doesn't really matter. There doesn't seem to be a place anywhere where all 6 of these holes line up, even though they do appear to be drilled symmetrically on both surfaces. And if we put this in a place where most of them do kind of agree, we'd still have a bit of an underlap at the end here. So, I think what we're going to do is plug the holes before putting the facing on. So that means we wouldn't have to mess around too much with them later. This is a 3/8 inch Veritas brand tapered plug cutter, which kind of ensures a nice snug fit. And this is a chunk of maple. Because there is a rather slow taper on these, the accurate diameter is somewhere halfway up the plug if you go to full depth, so you basically have to go to full depth. But those will go in there quite nicely. It's probably least messy to put the glue in the hole rather than on the plug. And I'm going to align them so that the grain is running upwards and down in the same direction as that of the headstock. Not that it's going to matter very much, because I believe most of these will get covered by the eventual bushings for the tuners. But do what we can. There's no set in the teeth, so it takes a long time, but it sure is slick. I mean, that literally is flush. Yeah, I think that nut has to come out. And yeah, that does appear to be something like JB weld in the nail grooves and the divots. So I'm going to scribe around this thing. Bonkety bonk with a piece of wood. Wow. That's a new one. Took a number of hits. Remnants of whatever adhesive was used in the headstock repair. So we got to clean up this surface. What this was a chunk of the original headstock facing with the logo, which was glued on sideways there. The owner has since taken that off. I should measure and see what the thickness of this headstock is, and whether or not we need to take off more material or less. And, you know, if this thing is too thick, it could cause a problem with the tuners. I have measured full thickness Gibson headstocks at the end here, anywhere between about 570 and maybe 610 thousandths. And that appears to be about 540 somewhere. And if we add this on, which is about 65 thousandths, that's going to be just about right, I think. Somewhere around 600 thousandths seems about normal to me. You have to skim off this whole business, which will require a jig. Here's my headstock routing jig, built with the usual speed and complete disdain for aesthetics, but it works, because I've done this before. One thing to know about Gibson headstocks, if you decide you want to start fooling around with them, is they taper. They don't look like it, but they do. They get thicker as they approach the nut and join the neck shaft because of the angles meeting. And in this case, it's pretty obvious because we also have the volute protruding behind there. So the 1970s introduction designed to prevent the headstocks from breaking, which doesn't actually prevent the headstocks from breaking. But this is important to know because it means anything you use for this purpose has to register off the front face of the headstock rather than the back. So I've got this platform which rests on it, and we'll leave a couple of strips of material for me to plane off on either side, but this will get the bulk of the work done, and it'll give me a flat surface to register my plane or chisel against. Remember, the end of the truss rod is exposed here, and it's difficult to flatten this whole surface by hand in any other way. Another thing to note is at this thickness, and without a headstock facing, this thing is very flexible. It can translate into some serious tuning issues because every time you bring a string up to pitch, it pulls all of the other strings flat because you're actually bending the headstock forward. So, got a bearing guided router bit, going to be very gentle, and I'm going to be mindful of the truss rod and not run the bit into it. There's a little flat area here which seems to be the lowest point, and I'm going to set the bit so that it scrapes that. We'll start off there. Okay, that's all I'm going to take off with the router. You can see there's some fairly deep fissures around some of the tuner holes. And also, there's a bit of a lip where we reach the end of the neck here. You can see here's the brake line, or two, that had previously been glued up. And this headstock is actually folded at this point. So we've actually gone a little deeper in this area than I was really hoping for. But, you know, I think we're still within reason. And like I said, things are going to stiffen up significantly once we've got this on there. So, now I'm going to get a chisel. So now I'm going to use my chisel, my plane, just to pare down and level these other areas. And then I'll sand the whole thing with a block. Big wide chisel like this, held flat on the face, keeps things flat. This transition area here is a little tricky. Most of it by sanding, I think. Some 100 grit paper on a flat block. Let's see where this fits best. We'd like 3/16 of an inch gap for the nut. However, on a Gibson, usually the headstock facing comes in and is feathered off so that the angle is cut out of the headstock facing. The nut sits on top of it at the back edge. I don't think we want to go that far. I'll line up the notch at the top. Okay, clamping calls. I've got this guy here with a cutout in the back that will go around the volute, and this venerable old specimen which goes on the top. Now I'm going to want to position this and then tape it on in the correct location so that it doesn't slide one direction or the other while it's being glued and clamped, so that we don't end up with like the Gibson falling off the edge of the headstock. That looks unprofessional. But I'm just going to put some glue on there. I'm going to use regular tight bond and clamp it up, and we'll let it sit overnight. Paste wax on the threads. I'm going to cover the cavity with some tape as well. Tight bond original. Not that it really matters in this case, because we don't ever expect it to come off again. But you could use Titebond 2 or 3. Those are more water resistance. Titebond 2 is pretty much waterproof. Titebond 3 is ridiculously waterproof in that you could put it in boiling water and it's still not going to come apart. Don't see a need for that in most woodworking, but that's what they do. I'm gluing something right now. Good Lord, don't do that. That'd be stupid. By which I mean, don't glue the head facing on backwards. This is low-tack tape. After applying a forest of clamps, I'll clean up some of the glue squeeze out. Oh, the other thing that lower clamp has is a couple of kerfs cut into it so that it will conform to the slight thickening that happens around the volute. And here we have a lovely ukulele. This was made by Koa Aloha. There's a date stamp on the neck block inside there suggesting it's from June of 2001. It's a concert size. That means you still have a fairly small body, but it's paired with a longer scale for the strings, usually about 15 inches, which gives you a little more projection and also some more space for your fingers. Soprano ukuleles can be, for me, they feel extremely cramped doing chording. And they do for a lot of people, even if you've got sort of moderately sized adult hands. This alleviates that. It lets you stretch out. This is all koa, which is a highly prized hardwood from the islands. It's not super hard. And it comes in various hues and sometimes highly figured. This is not an inexpensive instrument. It costs more than a lot of average full-size guitars. It's already had one crack repair, which was probably due to humidity shrinkage. If you figure this was made in the summer on Oahu, even with humidity control, it probably experienced a bit of a shock when it was first faced with a Canadian winter. Speaking of which, it's time to put those humidifiers in. I got the furnace fired up the other day. If you're slacking, your guitar's going to be crack-a-lackin'. The Koa Aloha company was started by Alvin Okami in the mid-90s, and it's become a family business. It's now run by his sons, Alan and Paul, and their children are also on staff. A big family thing. It's very well regarded. They have some low-cost models made for them in Asia for various market tiers, and then they have the homegrown top-notch production like this. They work with sawyers on the island to get really good quality koa, which is of course in short supply, and the harvest is carefully controlled, but they have the right contacts, I think it's good that they're using the material in a business on island, employing locals, and keeping the money near the trees, as it were, because it's a limited and valuable resource, and I think they're employing it in the right way. So the owner of this instrument has had it for a while, and is not wild about the friction tuners. These are of good quality, but she really wants geared tuners instead, so they're just a bit more convenient for her. And I think at some point this fell off a stand and took a hit on the edge. It's in a really tough spot, being on the back where it is, and it's caved in a bit. The major concern is to stabilize it and hopefully minimize the visual impact, although I've told her that it might be a bit difficult to make this disappear, just because of the nature of the damage and where it is. Should take note of the tuning here. This player likes the low G tuning. This is a wound G string. Okay. So, strings off. So I should just be able to rotate the screws until they come apart. So here's the workings on these. There's a screw, there's the peg, there's a little bushing that runs along the shaft, and there's also a spring that's in there which bears against the top portion, which fits against the bushing in the headstock. So this is kept under tension by that spring. The new tuners actually have the Koa Aloha symbol on them. That's a good start. And they've got this sort of pinky orange perloid button with a black metal. I'm not sure if these are going to fit in that hole, But regardless, we'll have to push the bushings out. Just get a drill bit of the appropriate size. It's actually one size smaller. And sort of lightly persuade by going around in a little circle on the metal portion of the bushing inside there. And gently push that out. These holes will need enlarging, and I'll have to decide on configuration that will allow these to work with the sort of elaborate curvaceous nature of the headstock. Checking out the barrels on these, they seem to taper from about 380 thousandths at the top to closer to 390 thousandths at the bottom. Probably the cleanest way to do this is with the large size violin peg reamer, because I'm working with a finished surface and this is less likely to tear out the wood than a drill bit. Oh, that's nice. The angled nature of the headstock brings these buttons pretty close to the wood, so I can't have them straight. That's not going to be a good idea, so we've got to tilt them slightly. And I think I'll do it so that the line on the end of the tuner bushing here coincides with the line of the headstock. Seems appropriate. And these guys can come pretty much straight out. Let's look at the front side. Yeah, I think that's okay. Sort of matches the spirit of the rest of the headstock. I'll hold these in place by lightly tightening down the surface nut here. These don't have to be super tight, and in fact that's not a good thing at this time of year. If I super tighten them come August, the peg head might swell enough that it could actually crack something. These are held on with screws, of course, and I'll just mark the center using an awl. AWL. Give myself a depth stop by flagging this 1/16 inch, is 1.5 millimeters. Drill bit with a piece of tape and drill away. Koa Aloha has graciously included 3 extra screws in their package, which is very nice customer service. It lets you drop 3 of them on the floor before you have to start getting worried. This crack is kind of complex, and in order for me to get it flat, I actually have to clamp on either side of it, sort of pushing down. Yeah, I think if I use this stout piece of acrylic as a caul and push firmly enough, it'll all come back together in something close to flat. First of all, I need to pick out this little bit of black fuzz which is infiltrated under the crack. I'm using some tight bond glue which I've thinned slightly with water to get deeper penetration. I'll leave you to say the rest of that. And I'll pump it on in with a little suction cup as I usually do. Just basically flood the surface. This will take a number of applications. Hopefully the water content will also swell the wood slightly up and bring it back level that way. The suction cup can also work sort of like the dent removal tool they use in automotive bodywork to pull dents out. By observing the crack, especially if it's angled, you can sort of figure out which side to clamp first so that you're squishing down. And I can see that there's some squeeze out coming out there. And the next clamp on the other side should do something similar. So in this case they're overlapping sort of like snake scales. Unclamped. It would be tempting to grab the laminate trimmer and just go to town. But there are a couple of areas at the top of the crest which can be kind of dangerous to get cutting through. So I'm going to trim back a little bit using a knife. This material, they call it fiber. I'm not exactly sure what was in the composition, but it's not the nicest thing to cut. I'm going to get rid of these big nasty points on the end because they have a tendency to sort of want to tear off. And of course it literally just did. The corner popped right off. So I'm going to have to build that up before I spray black on it. That's nasty. Before using the laminate trimmer, I'm going to mask off around it because the bearing, even though it's not supposed to spin, can cause rub marks on a finish like this, which already has a lot of character. I don't really want to add any more if I can avoid it. So, green tape, laminate trimmer with bearing guided bit. I'm going to build up the missing corner here with some epoxy putty. In the portion of the headstock that narrows to meet the nut, it's a surface that's undercut, so I can't really run the laminate trimmer against there without taking a big chunk out of the front of the headstock facing. So in this area I'm stuck using rasps and files and sandpaper. I'll use some 220 grit to block sand the surface. You can tell by the color of the sandpaper that this is more plastic than it is wood or paper or fiber. I think this is more like a stabilized something. I don't know. It's not the usual stuff. I have to say it every time. Tamiya color for plastics, Tamiya spray paint. This is TS14, perfect for Gibson headstocks. I'll spray on 2 light coats. This is a very dense pigment, so you get a lot of color in a very thin layer. Let it dry overnight. And now I'm going to scrape the letters clean. It's just thin enough that I can still see ghosting of these around the outline. It's good to have some photo reference on hand, because you might think you know the Gibson logo and then discover that you don't. Now I'm likely going to have to come back and re-scrape this after I put on my first layer of clear, because the outline is likely to run a bit into the pearl. Going to end up some black spots and stuff. I have at various times used watercolorist's stop out fluid or liquid frisket, which is something they use to mask off portions of a painting. I don't think it saved me very much time. So, quick shot of clear. Go back and re-scrape. If this is a modern headstock, that's fine. Because this is a 50-year-old guitar, there's going to be yellowing of the lacquer over top of the logo. So I'm going to shoot a very light coat of an amber over top of this just to give it a little bit of age. I'll peel the tape off and correct any bleed through that happened. That's not too bad. Again, 50-year-old guitar. Some edge damage is expected. Before I level sand and put on the last couple of coats, I want to drill through the tuner holes. You can see how far off we ended up. This is kind of a delicate operation. I'm going to use a brad point bit. Luckily we're putting Grovers back on this with the 10mm shaft diameter, so I don't have to change the shaft or plug or mess around with the spacing. Backing up the work on the other side is important. A light touch and not forcing the thing through is also important. Alright, we're going to leave this one here. I have to wait a while for the lacquer to really shrink up before I can level it and buff it out, because the locations of the plugged holes are starting to telegraph through. So I really want to give this a chance to contract fully and settle in. But I thought I'd put the tuners on so we could have a satisfying image to conclude with. The owner of this one is very capable of doing the final setup, so he's going to finish it off. I'm just using a damp paper towel to clean off any residual glue. It comes off the surface pretty easily because it's shiny and finished. It's turned out pretty nicely. It's pretty even. The cracks are still evident, and there is still some sort of color aberration going on the edge, but we can fix that. This is a Winsor & Newton Pro Marker in raw sienna, which will give us that sort of orangey background tone. I'll follow that up by stippling with this burnt sienna, which is one of my favorite touch-up markers. I'm using a little bit of Glue Boost Fill and Finish, the thin viscosity, with a whip tip, painting it on the cracks, little lines that are just proud of the surface. This is a cyanoacrylate super glue type thing, not a sponsor. It works pretty well. So I'm going to let this cure for a while, and I can scrape and level that. Single edge razor blade with some Scotch tape on either corner. Don't mind my rough looking thumb, it's been sanded so much this week. This is a delicate touch, no downward pressure to speak of. It's all sort of lateral, kind of glides over the surface. It's a little bit of 800 grit wet dry sandpaper, a flat block. I'll follow this up with 1200, 24, and 3600 grit. And then I'll bring up a shine with some polishing compound. I'm happy with this. Looks okay. I got some Aquila Nile Gut with a wound G. Put those on. Simple overhand knot will suffice. And I'm just going to melt the end a little bit here. Provide some extra insurance. This is a vintage style bridge. There are slots cut in the back of it and a recess that captures the knot. On the head end I simply thread it through the tuner. In this case, go around half a turn and put it through the hole again. That'll be enough to secure it. Basically pull the string taut. These things stretch an enormous amount, and if you leave any slack, you're basically going to end up filling up your tuner post before things get tight. So pull that as tight as it can go, and then give yourself some tension. And you're going to be tuning for a day, basically. Yeah, they stretch so much they go out of tune within a second. And you'll be doing this, as I said, for a full day before it starts to hold tune. I would caution you not to do what we do with steel string guitars and pull on the strings to stretch them or lock them into the tuners and that kind of thing. That's not going to harm a steel string very much, but it's possible to cause distortions in the nylon, which will create all kinds of tuning issues. You end up kinking the string. So just let them settle in naturally and resolve yourself to be patient, because it's going to take a while before it'll hold the tuning. And there we are. Really nice ukulele. It's got a great mellow tone to it. Very nice feeling neck. I don't have a whole lot of experience playing with a low G, but I'll give it a try and we'll make some noise.